The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be waiting a couple of minutes for everyone to join. I think everyone is here, so I'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. The topic for today's webinar is how to plan and fund Brownfield site assessment site investigations. My name is Nefeli Bompoti and I'm the project manager for the University of Connecticut Technical Assistance of Brownfield's program. I'm also a professor here in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at UConn. Our webinar will be recorded and then uploaded to our website so that you can find the recording and also the slides available on our website. For today's webinar, I'll start by introducing our services and what the University of Connecticut Technical Assistance for Brownfields can provide in terms of services. Then I'll go over the environmental site assessments, how to read the reports. So this webinar is essentially, we have a 30-minute webinar with questions and answers on the end. So essentially, the main takeaways for this webinar is to know, first of all, what is the scope for each of the environmental site assessments, what can you expect from those type of investigations, how to read the report, and what are the major takeaways, how to fund and what is the average cost of those assessments, and of course, what technical assistance programs are available to help you with the environmental site investigations. As I said, there is going to be some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have a question, please put it into the chat or the questions box, and I'll address those at the end of the webinar. So the University of Connecticut Technical Assistance for Brownfields is a program that is funded by the US EPA to provide support to New England communities with respect to investigation, cleanup, and redevelopment of abandoned or potentially contaminated sites, or brownfields, and protect public health and promote environmental justice. So as an overview of our services, we do provide direct technical assistance to communities. So for example, if you have a brownfield site and you have a couple of questions that with respect to the technical aspect of the investigation or the cleanup or the redevelopment, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to have a discussion with you through one-to-one consultation. So if you have a question, reach out, send us an email to ucontab@uconn.edu, and we're happy to discuss with you specific sites. Our feature municipal assistance program, so that is a program where communities participate and receive assistance through the activities of the service-based learning course that we have at UConn. So when a community participates into this program, they will receive assistance through the course, through by interacting with UConn students that are getting trained on brownfield redevelopment. Of course, our continuing education program, so we do workshops, we do webinars. So, for example, this webinar is part of our continuing education program, and all resources, all workshops or webinars, everything is uploaded on our website. So you can explore more there at tab.program.uconn.edu. And we also have a community engagement program. So if you're interested in conducting community engagement in your town or your region, again, feel free to reach out to us, and we are happy to help with that. Now, when thinking about the brownfield redevelopment process, when we have a brownfield site and we start by identifying that particular property that is a brownfield site, and we want to redevelop that site, we want to put it back to an effective reuse. So the main steps of the process include, first of all, planning, setting the goal, setting the vision for that property, including, finding what could be the potential scenarios for the development, what could be, the potential property recovery actions. Does the town need to acquire the property to actually do the redevelopment, and so on. And then once you go through the planning process to actually reach the redevelopment phase, there is a critical step in between. That critical step has to do with due diligence. Due diligence in terms of the environmental work, the environmental assessment, and the environmental cleanup of the site. So essentially, when you have a brownfield site, there is that intermediate step where you have to assess the property in terms of environmental contamination, and then clean up the property to actually, then start redeveloping the site to the future, to its future use. So today we'll be talking about that due diligence process, which is very important. It can be very costly, so that often is, the barrier to redevelopment. So there are many programs available out there to basically help you navigate this process. So in terms of the environmental due diligence, so the environmental assessment and cleanup essentially has several phases. And typically we categorize it in 5 distinct phases, starting from a phase 1, where we basically we're trying to understand the site and determine potential sources and locations for releases of contamination. So that phase typically does not involve any sampling. So we start by conducting an record review and understanding the site, and doing, understanding the site's history. And then once we move to a phase 2, the second phase of the environmental due diligence, we actually do environmental sampling in the locations where we suspect to have contamination, and finding if a release has occurred or not. So that is a phase 2 site investigation. If there is a need for additional sampling, for additional investigation, we will go to a phase 3, where we basically identify the extent of contamination on those particular areas where we identified in the phase 1. So the first 3 phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, have to do with the investigation of the site, the environmental investigation to identify, first of all, do we have releases of contamination, what type of contamination, and what is the extent. And then once we go to the phase 4 and the phase 5, then we go towards the cleanup of the property. So the phase 4 is essentially developing a remedial action plan for the site and actually cleaning up the property. And the phase 5 includes monitoring the site and making sure that there's no residual pollution. So for today's webinar, we'll be covering the phase 1, 2, and 3, which has to do with environmental investigation. The phase 5 and 4 and 5 have to do with the cleanup, so that will be the topic of a different webinar. Now, why is this important? What is that we're looking to actually answer when we do the investigation? And basically, once we start the investigation process, we want to find, first of all, where we have potential releases of contamination, what kind of contamination we have. We call that, in terms of, you'll see a lot of acronyms in the environmental field. So for example, contaminants of concern or constituents of concern, COCs, means what type of contaminants we have there. So we want to know exactly what are the substances that we have. Are they, hazardous substances or petroleum that we might have? We want to identify what is that we have. And then the other 2 questions have to do with how this might migrating in the environment, right? In the subsurface, or you can travel, with the surface water. What is the migration pathways of that release that we may have, and who might be impacted by that release? So essentially, when we do the investigation process, we try to answer those 4 questions. Basically investigating, what has happened, what has happened at the site, how would this change, how would this migrate, and who will be impacted by that. Now, I know that this is a very busy slide, but this is very, very important. So the environmental site investigation is important for what we call all appropriate inquiries. What is that? So in many cases, right, when you have a contaminated site or a potentially contaminated site, there might be liability. And the owner of the site might have the liability and will be responsible to clean the property up. Even sometimes if they didn't cause the contamination there. So when you're seeking protection from potential liability from CERCLA, CERCLA is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. So that is a federal program. So when you're seeking liability from CERCLA, even if you are an innocent landowner or a contiguous property owner or a bona fide prospective purchaser, you need to conduct all appropriate inquiries. What is that? So essentially, all appropriate inquiries, it's the phase 1 environmental assessment conducted per certain standards that the AAI has. So the all appropriate inquiries final rule has several standards that we need to follow in order to do that phase 1 site investigation to get the liability protection from CERCLA. This is very important, especially when you're trying to acquire a site. If you need to conduct all appropriate inquiries first, so that you don't get the liability for the contamination of the site. So essentially, we have certain standards. Those are called the ASTM international standards that we need to follow to conduct those site investigations in order to get the liability protection. So it's important to know that when we do a site assessment, we also do this to actually get liability protection. Besides that liability protection and the federal standards, there are also additional guidance from the states. So each state has a characterization guidance and documentation with respect to additional requires that they might have with respect to how to conduct an environmental investigation. So because I don't have the time to go over each one of the documents that the states have, the New England states have, I'll send you, this, the slides with all the links provided with respect to the documentation for each state, so that you have additional guidance depending on which state you are. So there might be additional items that you need to follow with respect to when you're doing the site investigation. Now, in terms of who can actually do the environmental site assessments, so certain states have an environmental professional program. So those environmental professionals are certified by the state and can conduct the environmental site assessment, and they can sign the document and submit it to the state environmental authority. So Connecticut has an environmental professional program that is called the Licensed Environmental Professionals, or LEPs, and Massachusetts also has one, the LSPs, which stands for Licensed Site Professionals. For the other New England states, there's no state program, which means that an environmental consulting company will submit the environmental site report to the state, and the state will basically go over the report and make sure that meets all the requirements. For Connecticut and Massachusetts, the states have given the right to the LEPs and LSPs to basically sign off the documents and conduct those site investigations. Now, starting from a phase 1 site investigation, what is that we can expect and how we can actually help? Those documents are very long documents. They're could be more than 1,000 pages with a ton of data. So understanding what to expect from each one of the reports and how to actually identify, okay, what are the major takeaways. It's something that is very useful for environmental planning and in general for planning for brownfields redevelopment. So a phase 1 site investigation, and again, per ASTM standards, and those are standards that we typically follow when we conduct a phase 1 site investigation. There are certain components that the report needs to have. So the first component has to do with conducting a site reconnaissance survey, where, for example, the environmental professional will go to the field and then, do essentially a survey. Will go to the site, do the survey, and identify, which areas might suspect contamination. That also include interviews with past and current owners or responsible personnel. And then the other component of the report has to do with providing adequate information with respect to the site description, where is the location of the site, what is the land use, are there any buildings there, what is the square footage of the buildings, are there any utilities, what are the surface cover or other type of information with respect to the site description. The site's history with respect to who owned the site, what was the history of the previous uses, that is very important. What kind of processes they might have at the property, where they might handle chemical substances or other materials, which is important in order to identify where they might have been, we might suspect contamination. Other site records like federal and state documents, the environmental setting of the property in terms of geology, hydrogeology, and groundwater classification. And also it comes with a series of graphs, topographic maps, for example, sunbore maps, and previous sampling, if any, or any other hydrogeologic information. So typically the types of maps that are included in those phase 1 site investigations they are either the sample fire insurance maps. Those maps were essentially maps that were used for assessing the risk of particular properties from insurance agents back in the day. So they date back to the 1800s, but we still use them for the purposes of the environmental site assessments, because they show the change in the property from through the years. So it's basically it gives you kind of like a timeline of what has happened at the site since the 1800s. We have aerial photos and also topographic maps. So the report will have those maps in the appendix. And it also comes with a regulatory database review. If you've seen this is a report that is generated as a radius map. So if you see here, there is, for example, this is our target site, and then there is certain radius around the site where we check what? We check other properties that might have entered federal databases or state databases, in databases that have to do with documented, let's say, environmental contamination. So it will be essentially an extensive report showing other properties around the site, which might be, a Superfund site, or they have entered, let's say, Circular's program or the state's program. And we need to know this information in terms of what other properties are there that might be contaminated. So essentially, the key findings of a phase 1 will include what? Number one finding is, those areas where we suspect to have contamination. So those areas we call recognized environmental conditions, RECs, or areas of concern, AOCs. So typically a report will have a list of those areas reported in the conclusions of the report. And they will say, for example, and I have here an example from a previous report where they actually have the list of those recognized areas of recognized environmental conditions. And they say, mold, water intrusion, we might have, water damage, throughout the building, or lead-based paint in those areas of the building, or asbestos-containing materials, and so on. So they basically identify areas where we suspect to have contamination. We don't know that yet. That is based on the previous uses and based on the site reconnaissance. Together with that list, the report will also have, so this is from a different report where basically we have the site layout with those areas of concern identified. So it will have a figure where it says, okay, well, this is the list of areas of concern, and in many cases it might be many areas. For example, here you see, it goes up to 31 areas where, the environmental professional identified by doing this work. So that gives you a sense of where do we suspect to have contamination. The other takeaway, the finding of the phase 1 site investigation is, okay, what happens next? What is the recommendation? Is there any recommendation for additional investigation for a phase 2? So a report will basically, a phase 1 report will have this in the conclusions and say, well, a phase 2 environmental science investigation is recommended to be conducted for this and this region. So that gives you a sense, okay, well, there is a need for a phase 2 investigation. And the phase 2 investigation, the environmental professional will basically examine if the release has actually occurred or not in those areas where we identified in the phase 1 investigation. So basically, the scope of the phase 2 is to actually collect additional information, collect actually sufficient information to determine if we have a release or not at those areas where we identified in the phase 1. So once start preparing the phase 2, there's a whole process where you actually, first of all, you have to develop a sampling plan or a phase 2 scope of work, as we call it. Where are we going to sample? Perform the field activities, right? Which means go and analyze, take samples and analyze the sample. What we call the conceptual site model is essentially, and I will not get into that a lot. So it's essentially how, what would be the migration pathways and who will be impacted. So understanding how the contaminants might move, might be transported into the subsurface. And essentially, the next step is to first of all recommend, if we need additional investigation or not. So when we do and I'll take it from the beginning here. So when we do the sampling plan, right, we say, okay, now we're going to sample. The next step is to say, okay, what is that we're going to sample? We usually sample soils, either surface soil. So you see, for example, if there is a superficial soil that we want to take a sample from, we'll just open a test pit. If we want to take samples from a deeper, to another depth, we typically do soil borings. So you will see, for example, in the report, documentation about soil boring, which is basically, opening a hole in the ground and taking the core and doing essentially the analysis on this sample collected from that. We might want to sample groundwater. So that is by advancing a monitoring well. Again, I will not go into a lot of details about how we do that. But essentially, when you open a monitoring well, then you can take a sample from your groundwater and analyze that. And that the monitoring well typically stays there so you can sample multiple times. In cases where we might have volatile compounds and also there might be a building or a closed structure on site, there might be a risk for vapor intrusion. So in that case, we might want to sample soil vapor as well. So that is something to think about. You might also see, phase 2 investigations with, soil vapor sampling. And essentially, once the sampling activities are when they conduct the sampling activities, the report will have again a graph that shows what? First of all, the locations where they did soil borings. So this is an example from another report where they did the soil borings here, you can see, and then the locations of the monitoring well, so that you can see where exactly the environmental professionals sampled at the site. In terms of reporting for the phase 2 site investigation, essentially the main goal is to confirm if we actually had a contaminant release at those particular areas where we identified in the phase 1. So that's the number one goal. And then we have to report what are the levels and the types of contaminants in those areas. So for example, again, this is language from another report, and it tells you, in this, soil sample, we identified this type of contaminant, we identified metals, and in many cases, they might compare that with the standard, with the regulatory limits. So you might see that as well. So typically, phase 2, they will report, okay, did we have a release? And what is the type of contamination in this area? And what is the level? What is the number? And sometimes they might say, does this number exceed that, regulatory limit or not? And then at the end, there will be a recommendation. You might say, well, we might need, we had, substantial, let's say, data gaps for XYZ reasons, and we need to sample more. We need to do additional sampling to be able to confirm, to identify the extent of contamination. And that is where they actually suggest a phase 3. So a phase 3 is an extension of the phase 2 with additional investigation at each release area, where essentially you can identify think about as the 3-dimensional extent of contamination, where you identify, okay, I know that I have this contaminant here. Now I want to sample more to capture both the spatial distribution of the contaminant, but also, what is the depth. So that's why we call it a 3D representation. And we also want to see, in many cases, how this distribution and concentration of those substances change with time. So there might be, samples taken at different times. So essentially, think about a phase 3 investigation as the full delineation of the site with respect to the extent of the contamination present. Now, that basically covers the phase, the scope of the phase 1, 2, and 3, and what to expect, what information to search and find, from each report. So there might be other types of investigation. Typically, the phase 1, 2, and 3, they do refer to essentially soil, groundwater, soil vapor, but there are many cases where we might do an assessment on a building to identify the hazardous building materials. So those we call hazardous building materials surveys, where we identify if there are hazardous materials present on specific building. And typically, we search for asbestos, we search for PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, and lead-based paint. So those are typically other studies that we do. Again, if there is a building and if the building is old, we suspect that there might be, some hazardous building materials there. Then we conduct, the survey to identify again, the areas where we might have those building materials. Those are the most common, but there might be other materials that they're there. So in terms of costs, what to expect in terms of costs with respect to the investigations. So phase 1 environmental site assessment will cost about $3,000 to $6,000. That's a typical average. A phase 2 could be from $20,000 to $40,000, and again, that really depends on the site and the complexity of the site. So the range, it can really range from 20 to 40 or even more sometimes. A phase 3 site investigation could be, again, from $50,000 to $100,000, and the building hazardous building material survey could be from 10 to 20. Typically, again, it varies with the extent of of the size of the building and so on. So those are average cost that you can actually, for example, utilize as an average to put together, let's say, in a budget for a grant proposal. So we used that before, and it's typically, within that range. So, however, the whole process is expensive, right? So how do we really fund those environmental site assessments? Well, we have great programs. We have great programs that can help with the funding, finding funding for assessments, either from federal sources. So, for example, the EPA's Brownfield program, and the upcoming solicitation for the Brownfield grant is coming up next fall. So either we can target an assessment grant, which is primarily for doing assessments at one particular site or multiple sites across the community. This year will be up to $500,000, so there is a lot of funds for the program. So if you're thinking about, if you have several sites in your community and you want to do assessments, that is, a very good program to apply for. If you have one particular site that is, let's say, a little bit more complex, where you have both assessment and cleanup activities, then you can also apply for a multi-purpose grant, because that allows for both types of activities at the same time, and it can actually give you up to $800,000. So that is also, for a particular site or a corridor around the site. In terms of other funding sources for assessments, the TPA program, the Targeted Brownfield Assessment Program, that is a program that EPA Region 1 has and essentially provides site assessments for sites. So if, let's say, you don't want to go through the competitive process of putting together a proposal and applying for a grant, you can also reach out to Jim Byrne, the regional Brownfield coordinator from EPA, to request information about the TBA program and how you can do assessments for particular sites. I know that the program has a lot of funds, so it's definitely a good option. And also, you can fund assessments through the state programs. The states also have funding programs for assessments, and you can visit our website. We have gathered all the state resources. So if you go to our website and state resources, we have resources for each state. So each state will have a separate, Brownfields program that they might have assessment funds. So 2 states in New England, and New Hampshire, and Rhode Island actually got $2 million for to conduct community-wide assessment. That will start I want to say the next year. So there is going to be a lot of funds available through New Hampshire and Rhode Island. Connecticut also has a program through DCD for assessments. And Massachusetts CEP, the Vermont and Maine, and the Maine program. Reach out to. If you can find the resources from our website, or feel free to reach out to me, and I can provide contact information to the state coordinators so that they can give you more information about how to fund assessments from the states. And with that, I'll also like to mention here that if, for example, you're planning to, you need some help with the site assessments, we can also help as UConn tab. If you're planning to apply, for example, for an EPA grant proposal to fund several assessments in your community, we can help with that. So we have our municipal assistance program, which is open for the fall semester, where we help communities with their EPA Brownfields grant applications. If you need assistance with respect to a more technical component, like, for example, summarizing a report, we also provide a technical support through the spring semester and summer. So to give you a little bit more information, so that is the fall municipal assistance program for the EPA grant proposals. It's now open. You can apply to receive assistance in the fall, and basically will help you with the description of the Brownfield site, the budgets, help with the demographics, and also review your application before you submit it. So if you're thinking of applying for an EPA grant, we're happy to help with that. If, for example, you might need help with summarizing previous environmental conditions at a particular site, or summarizing and doing kind of like a data gap analysis for previous environmental assessments, or developing a phase 2 scope of work and some budget estimates for a particular site. Those are activities that we support during the spring semester and summer. So if you have a particular site and you have the reports and you would like to help to summarize those reports, we can definitely help you with that. And with that, I'd like to provide our contacts. I would like to acknowledge our program director, Professor Marisa Chrysokou, and feel free, to reach out to us and if you have any questions. And with that, I'd like to open the Q&A time. If you have any questions?
Hey, Nefeli, there's a couple questions that have come in while you were talking, and I encourage folks to also put questions in the question box that's in your control panel on your screen there. We'll start with this one. Is AAI separate from the Connecticut Transfer Act?
Very good question. Yes, it's separate from the Connecticut Transfer Act. So the AAI is typically for protection by circular liability, which circular liability is essentially federal liability. the Connecticut Transfer Act is a program that Connecticut has. Essentially, the requirements, though, they're pretty similar, so you would still have to do the phase 1 site investigation per ASTM standards. So the process is kind of similar, but there are two separate things. One is the AAI refers to federal circular liability. The other one refers to the state's program, the Connecticut Transfer Act. And I hope.
And the second one we have is, I can't imagine a situation where a phase 1 would not recommend a phase 2. Have you ever seen a case of this?
Very good question. It's very rare to actually see a case where there's not going to be recommendation for additional sampling, unless, because you usually, when you start the process of the environmental site investigation, unless there is something that perhaps, oh, we went to the site and there is not really much there, but it's very rare to happen. It's very rare.
Okay, well, those are all the questions that have come in. Give maybe people 1 more minute if they have a burning question they want to put in the question box there.
Excellent questions, though.
Okay, well, it looks like that's it for questions, Nefeli.
All right. So thank you all for attending the webinar. Again, if you have another question, or you'd like to to receive some technical assistance from our program, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to discuss with you. Thank you, and I'll be sending you the slides through an email, and everything will be uploaded on our website if you'd like to take another look at the webinar or the slides. So thank you.